Hi friends, it is first chapter Friday and I snuck away from my family for a little bit to get to read to you guys from my book, To Catch a Suitor. This is the second book in my Dalton family series and it follows two characters, Elizabeth and Oliver, that you see in that first book. Okay, here we go. Let's read. From To Catch a Suitor. Don't judge my reading out loud skills too harshly, okay? All right, here we go. It was Elizabeth's torn slipper during her first ball of the season that led her to believe that perhaps bad omens were real, and if so, her first season was not looking bright. Seeing Oliver lead yet another beautiful young lady onto the dance floor only increased her worry. She had suspected the season was going to be torturous, and she was not wrong. But Elizabeth was not one to wallow or brood. She swallowed against the lump in her throat and tore her eyes away from the man she had loved since she was 10 years old and searched for an exit from the ballroom. She had only arrived at the ball a little over a half hour ago, and already she was aching to leave. Not that this feeling surprised her. Crowds were the very worst. Elizabeth lifted up onto her tiptoes in search of a doorway that would lead out of the ballroom, but she could not see one around the colorful swirl of satin, lace, and feathers. Really, did women look in the mirror before a ball, assess the feathers in their hair, and think, "My goodness, how lovely I look impersonating a large bird"? The season was in full swing now, and this ball was a horrifying crush. Despite the short amount of time Elizabeth had spent under the eyes of the ton, beads of sweat were already forming at the back of her neck, and the heat of so many bodies squeezed into one room together was giving her a headache. On top of all of this, her rebellious little slipper was all but hanging off her foot. Her eyes raced over the bustling room, noting each of the rosy faces, smiles plastered on, eager to prove their enjoyment in the night. How could every person in the ballroom truly be enjoying themselves? As always, her eyes gravitated to the dance floor, seeking again the tall man with sandy blonde hair and a physique too wonderful for his own good. Oliver appeared to be having the most magnificent time of his life, sweeping easily around the room in spite of the overwhelming movement and noise surrounding them. In the crush, Elizabeth felt short of breath, as though she wanted to disappear and melt into the wall, feelings she was certain her older sisters never felt among society. As the middle daughter of the Duke of Dalton, sister to both the Earl of Kinsworth and the Countess of Hatley, Elizabeth had already been forced into introductions to at least 50 people whose importance made her legs wobble and her voice crack when she spoke. This was not the plan. It was decidedly opposite of the plan. Elizabeth had hoped that London's air would somehow change her into the outgoing socialite she longed to be. Oliver Turner was nothing but outgoing. Everything about him oozed confidence and charisma. He loved society events, flirting and dancing, and then spending the summer at Dalton Park, telling Elizabeth all about his life in town. As the younger sister of Oliver's best friend, Carver, Elizabeth had not always counted herself as his friend, but as they had grown older, the 5-year span between them had seemed less and less like an impediment to friendship. Now she considered him her very best friend, and they shared all kinds of confidences with one another. But this wasn't about him. This was her season, her chance to show Oliver, herself, that she was no longer the young girl who had chased Oliver, Carver, and Mary around the park grounds, begging to be included in their games. Actually, she hadn't been that girl for some time. Elizabeth now had 20 years in her dish, soon to be 21. Really, if anything, she was showing Oliver that she was no longer the schoolroom miss who would listen to him talk for hours on end about whatever love he'd most recently tumbled into. He was always doing that, falling in love. But again, this wasn't about him. As Elizabeth had grown older, she and Oliver had turned into real friends. especially during Carver's dark years after the death of his fiancée, when he refused to return home. Oliver had still come to Dalton Park every summer, however, and she spent those warm, magical months with Elizabeth and her family, and mostly Elizabeth, riding, walking, reading, and doing most all activities that unfortunately didn't include falling in love with her. However, she had come to terms with it, because she wasn't one to wallow. Elizabeth hadn't always been this comfortable with the idea that the man she had spent her whole life dreaming about would never reciprocate her affection. No, this was a new resolution, a decree written into her heart and sealed with the wax of her melted hopes and dreams. Elizabeth had decided before she came to London for her first season that she would not waste it wearing the willow for a man who didn't want her back. She deserved someone who cared for her just as much as she cared for him, which is why she was determined to spend her summer kicking Oliver Turner out of her heart and finally letting herself shine like a town diamond. Except she didn't feel very shiny at the moment, what with her displaced shoe and her wobbly legs and her voice cracking as if she were an adolescent boy. The sights and sounds and smells of the ballroom were really too much for her. She didn't understand how anyone looked forward to these events. Everywhere Elizabeth turned, someone fluttered a fan, wafting the smell of sweat directly into her face. She pushed around a group of flittering debutantes. Still no exit. She did, however, have a perfect view of Oliver in his beautifully tailored blue jacket, flashing that charming smile of his to a young woman whom Elizabeth didn't actually know, but still managed to hate all the same. Someone should really tell the girl that pink was not her color. It washed her out. Elizabeth was still seeking an exit when a large feathered coiffure swayed to the music, out of the way enough to give Elizabeth a blessed view of a door. She shuffled across the room, careful to slide her foot with the ripped slipper instead of fully picking it up. It was just like her to somehow manage to rip a brand new slipper during a ball. It was a subtle or not so subtle reminder that even though she was a daughter of the Duke of Dalton, she didn't fit in there with the ton, and she would never get Oliver to see her as the right woman for him. Drat, not Oliver. Not caring about Oliver's opinion of her was turning out to be a more laborious task than she had anticipated. She pressed on towards the door, not allowing herself to glance back at the man she loved, but stopped when she felt someone grasp her arm. Elizabeth took in a deep breath. It's not going to be Oliver. It's not going to be Oliver. It wasn't Oliver. "Where are you going?" Mary, her older sister and chaperone for the season, shouted above the orchestra. Elizabeth leaned so Mary could hear her. "To the ladies' retiring room. I just need a little air." She tucked her torn slipper a little further under her dress. Mary's light gray eyes pierced Elizabeth with skepticism. Elizabeth knew that look well. As the oldest of the 4 siblings, Mary possessed the uncanny ability to sniff out a problem when one of them was in trouble. Elizabeth wished she could plug her sister's nose. She didn't want Mary to know the truth just then. Mary couldn't know about her torn slipper, or that she had the urge to scream every time someone addressed her as Lord Kinsworth's darling little sister. And most of all, Mary couldn't know that Elizabeth ached to accidentally spill a glass of sherry on the pretty miss currently on Oliver's arm. She was wearing a silk gown, and it would stain famously. Mary must have seen the evil look in Elizabeth's eye. "Are you feeling well?" she asked, not releasing Elizabeth's arm. Mary's eyes scoured Elizabeth's face for the truth. "Perfectly," Elizabeth lied. "I'm simply not accustomed to a crush like this, but I'll adjust." "You're sure? Do you want to leave early?" Yes, she did. But Mary had been smiling all night as if she had actually been enjoying the smell of so many perspiring bodies. So Elizabeth lied again. "I'm having a grand time, Mary, so you may stop giving me that mother hen look of yours." Elizabeth saw a smirk begin on her sister's mouth and decided to push the conversation in a different direction. "How are you feeling? Is it too hot in here for you?" She glanced briefly to the swell of Mary's abdomen. Elizabeth had been hesitant to accept her sister's offer to act as her chaperone for the season when Mary had first suggested it. Mary was pregnant with her second child, and Elizabeth worried that all of the late-night balls, morning callers, and constant events associated with the launching of a debutante into society would be too much for her sister's constitution, especially since Mary's pregnancy was considered delicate, given the loss of her last pregnancy. But then, just before it had been time to leave Dalton Park for the season, Kate, her younger sister, had fallen ill with influenza, and Mamma had not felt comfortable leaving her. Elizabeth was forced to accept Mary as chaperone. But just now, when she was hoping to go home early, Elizabeth was feeling glad that Mamma had stayed home to nurse Kate back to health instead of accompanying her to London, and hoped that perhaps her sister's swollen ankles would work in her favor. Mary smiled broadly. "Actually, I'm feeling fantastic. It's so nice to be out in society again now that the constant feeling of sickness has left me." "Just wonderful." "Wonderful! Enjoy yourself. I'll only be a minute." Elizabeth mustered a believable smile and hoped it would be enough for Mary to release her hold. Her older sister looked hesitant, but then finally relented. "All right, if you're sure. Shall I come with you?" Part of Elizabeth wanted to state that she was a grown woman and perfectly capable of taking herself off to the retiring room on her own. But instead, she said, "That's not necessary. Thank you." Mary walked back to join her husband, Robert, and Elizabeth darted, or slid, toward the inviting door on the edge of the ballroom. No one seemed to notice her open the door and slip through. One glance around the dim hallway told Elizabeth this was not part of the home in which she was supposed to be. The ladies' retiring room must have been through a different door. Elizabeth pressed her lips together, looking both ways down the empty hallway. Her palms were sweating and butterflies fluttered in her stomach in a way that they always did when an adventure was in the making. Thoughts of spending the remainder of the night exploring the halls played in her mind. It could be like a game, trying to avoid detection, No. Focus, Elizabeth. You are an adult now. Act like one. She refocused her attention on the matter at hand, raising her gown and removing her slipper to inspect it. Of course. Irreparable. She flicked the limp, hanging sole, no longer attached to the rest of her shoe, and silently cursed its delicate fabric. There you are. Elizabeth jumped and turned toward the man who had just stepped into the darkened hallway with her. He glanced quickly over his shoulder, peeking out the door before closing it. Oliver Turner. Yay! That was chapter 1. I hope you guys liked it. I'm so sorry that the first half of this video was sideways, but hopefully it wasn't too distracting. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you liked it. And I hope you go read To Catch a Suitor if you haven't already.